2 boys, 12 and 9 years old. Princes. Their father, King Edward IV, had just died, unexpectedly. The eldest of the 2 boys, Edward, had already been announced as the next King of England in the streets of London. Both boys were placed in the Tower of London, escorted by their uncle, their father's loyal brother, Richard. The boys' uncle Richard had been made protector of the 12-year-old Edward in his father's will. The death of their father caused a huge power struggle between their mother's family and their uncle Richard that would ultimately result in their disappearance and their end. Richard had escorted Prince Edward personally to the Tower. The idea was that it was for his protection. His younger brother followed shortly after. At the time, none of these actions were considered odd or malicious. The Tower of London was the traditional place that the new monarch would have stayed before their coronation ceremony. But instead of Edward having his coronation as was originally planned for on June 22nd, 1483, his uncle Richard began the process of having Parliament rule that the 2 princes were actually illegitimate, that their father had been previously betrothed to another woman, and so his marriage to their mother was invalid, and therefore neither would be in line to inherit the throne. And the next person who should be king was Richard himself. The last records we have of the 2 princes being seen was written in the Great Chronicle on June 16th, that the 2 boys had been seen shooting arrows and playing in the garden at the Tower sundry times. Then, an Italian diplomat, not too long after, reported a mixture of perhaps gossip and perhaps eyewitness that the princes were withdrawn to the inner apartments of the Tower proper, and day by day began to be seen more rarely behind the bars and windows, until at length they ceased to appear altogether. Already there is a suspicion that they have been done away with. In July, the 2 princes' uncle was crowned King Richard III. The boys were never seen again, and speculation about what happened to them has been the subject of debate for centuries. The main suspect has always been Richard, who had so much to gain with their disappearance. The narrative of what happened to the boys and the possible suspects of the crime were not even introduced for 30 years after their disappearance, and it was done by Henry VIII's Chancellor, Thomas More. More wrote a dramatic version of what happened in his The History of King Richard III. This manuscript was unfinished and was first published years after More's death. More, whose words have ended up massively shaping the narrative of the history of not only Richard III, but also the 2 princes, was only 7 years old when Richard III died at the Battle of Bosworth. Historians have combed through this posthumous retelling of events by More that originally had frequent misnaming of important figures' names, wrong ages given, the use of hearsay, local gossip, and legend as fact, is often cited with, "as some say," "I have heard a credible report," and "they say." It was More who introduced the idea that a man named Sir James Tyrrell and another named Dighton had confessed to the murdering of the 2 boys, and that the boys were buried underneath the stairs at the Tower of London. Moore also went on to say that a priest had gone to where the bones had been hidden and reburied them. The location of where the priest had put the bones was lost because the priest had died. In 1674, renovations were being done on the Tower of London. Workmen found the skeletal remains of what appeared to be children underneath the staircase of the White Tower. It was immediately and unequivocally assumed that these remains were that of the two sons of King Edward IV. The belief was that the finding of these remains corroborated the story that Moore had presented. The bones were ordered by Charles II, who was king at the time, to be taken to Westminster Abbey and reinterred. It wasn't until 4 years later that in 1678 the bones were eventually placed in an urn that again stated that the bones were the remains of Edward V and his brother, and that they had been murdered by their Uncle Richard. In 1933, it was decided to re-examine the bones to see if any conclusions or further information could be ascertained. When the urn was opened, 2 partial skeletons of children's remains were found. There were 2 skulls, one of which was badly damaged. There was also a collection of other miscellaneous bones from different animals, as well as a few rusty nails. The methods used to determine the ages of the 2 skeletons in the 1930s is now considered extremely controversial. Even the sex of the remains was not established. There were also multiple other sets of children's bones that have been found that could possibly be the bones of the 2 princes. There were remains found when Sir Walter Raleigh was imprisoned in the Tower. There were remains found when the Tower's moat was drained in the mid-19th century. And more still in 1789 when 2 small child-sized coffins were found walled up in a hidden space next to the vault holding the coffins of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville at Windsor Castle. So, were the bones that were found at the Tower of London really the 2 princes? For now, that centuries-old mystery still remains unsolved.